Proponent of legalizing and taxing marijuana for just about as long as I've enjoyed using marijuana, which is more than 40 years ago. But my first encounter was something quite different, and I'll tell you about it in a minute. But I wanted to first summarize or enumerate the 4 of the reasons I think you should support legalizing marijuana, and I hope to make that case this afternoon. First is that the passage of marijuana prohibition is one of the most shameful acts in the history of this country. It was based not on science, but on bureaucratic self-interest and, as we'll see, on blatant racism. Secondly, is whatever the intentions were about marijuana prohibition, it hasn't worked. About 100,000 smokers, according to the government, when prohibition was passed. There are millions today. It may be the greatest single failure of any government program in the history of America, and that is saying a lot. We know, as Milton Friedman told us, that when a program doesn't work at the bureaucratic level, the bureaucratic response is to say, well, it doesn't work because it's not big enough. Let's throw more money at it. And that's what we've done for 70 years. It's time for a new strategy. We've not only wasted tax dollars, we've ruined lives, and we've foregone the revenue that we could collect if marijuana were regulated and taxed. Thirdly, it denies safe and effective medicine to many patients who need it, like my late wife. Marijuana is not only a safer alternative to a lot of powerful pharmaceuticals, and you see the side effects that range right up to death, and the side effects so severe that often a patient ends up with a drug that treats this problem, and that has a side effect you treat with another drug, and that drug needs another drug, and they have a cocktail of legal pharmaceuticals that just leave them catatonic. I mean, yeah, you're kind of working on the disease. Marijuana doesn't do that, and for many diseases, it's not only a safer alternative, it's the only substance that works. And thirdly, it's, I think, an illogical public policy. I hope to demonstrate this afternoon that if you take the 3 most commonly used drugs, not including caffeine, alcohol, tobacco, and marijuana, by every objective standard, marijuana's the least dangerous. So if we're not going to encourage adults to consider using a safer alternative to alcohol and tobacco, at least we ought to stop arresting them for it. We have plenty of enemies in the world today, and we're spending billions of dollars to create more enemies right in our front yard. So let me go back. What was my first encounter with marijuana? Well, it wasn't in college. I was in the Navy, and I was an officer on a board hearing the case of a sailor apprehended smoking pot on the ship. And I wrote the dissenting opinion in the verdict because I felt this young man didn't get a severe enough penalty. At that time, I believed everything I'd been told about marijuana and that you've been told and that you may still believe today. It's a terribly dangerous substance. Murder, insanity, and death, and lung cancer, and brain damage, and enlarged breasts on men, never on women, it's always on men. Reckless driving, schizophrenia, virtually every ailment that mankind can have has been blamed on marijuana. And yet somehow, maybe one of the worst things it does is lead on to more dangerous drugs, although I don't know how they could be more dangerous than that. So I write that dissenting opinion, and a couple years later, as Stephen mentioned, I'm at Indiana University working on my MBA, and within a month after I arrived, there's a poll taken that shows a majority of the business school classmates, which are a fairly conservative group, they smoke pot. I'm horrified. I'm surrounded by drug addicts. I need to save them. So I go to the library, and I'm going to educate myself on marijuana so I can educate them and keep them from a life of addiction. And I read all the books that are there, like 4 or 5, and they all reach the same conclusion. That marijuana is not harmless. Nothing is. But it's a relatively benign substance. But I say to myself, the next time somebody offers me a puff, I'm going to take it. And I do. And one of my first thoughts is, this is illegal? That's a senseless law. I'm going to try to change it. And so I got involved 42 years ago. We've worked hard. It's still illegal. But in the last 12 months, we've made more progress than in the previous 40 years. So what did I learn about marijuana? What is it? Well, it's a plant that's been cultivated since the beginning of recorded time for 4 purposes. One is hemp. It's fiber. if it's grown for the purposes of fiber and not for psychoactive substances. Hemp is illegal in the U.S. because it got caught up in marijuana prohibition, although Senator Mitch McConnell and Senator Rand Paul have proposed legalizing it in the states, and it'd be interesting to see if that doesn't happen. And there's a Tennessee senator who's also thinking about it. In some cultures, it's a religious sacrament, as alcohol is in some religions. It's useful as medicine, and we'll get into that. And there's a list on page 1 of the brochure, and I'm going to use that brochure both to keep me on track, because I forgot to set my timer, so Joe, let me know as time approaches. And you read that list and you think, God, it's like snake oil. How can it be so effective against so many different things? MS, ALS, cancer. We'll get into that in a minute, and I hope to explain it. And then fourthly, it's a mild intoxicant, sort of like having a beer or two or a martini, which I also enjoy. It enhances our awareness of our surroundings and our intellect. It increases our appreciation of music, hence the association of marijuana and music. I don't think there was a major jazz musician or rock and roll singer that had been busted for pot. It increases it stimulates appetites, increasing our appreciation of food. And the wife of one of your members told me that it even makes sex bearable. So, if it does all of these things, why is it illegal?
When did she come?
Yesterday. So, if it does all these wonderful things, including helping Lydia, then why is it illegal? Well, interestingly, or sadly, marijuana is illegal today for one reason, because alcohol was re-legalized. We passed the Volstead Act. We prohibit alcohol. It doesn't work. We repealed the Volstead Act, constitutional amendment. But in the meantime, we have created a vast bureaucracy, or big bureaucracy, to enforce alcohol prohibition. And as Ronald Reagan warned us, the nearest thing we're going to find to eternal life on earth is a bureaucracy. They don't go away. So they moved the agents in the Treasury Department who were enforcing alcohol prohibition. Alcohol prohibition, like marijuana prohibition initially, was a revenue act in the Treasury Department. And they moved them over to this newly formed Bureau of Narcotics and Dangerous Drugs, today's DEA. And so there they are, but there's only one anti-drug law in the books, the Harrison Act of 1914, aimed at opiates. It's not enough to keep them busy to justify their existence. They need a new prohibition, and they need it fast. And marijuana is ideal. It's not used by very many people, and most of those are minorities, Hispanics and blacks, who have virtually no political influence at that time and no influence over the media. So the government can say anything it wants to demonize marijuana, and they do. And you read these statements on the top of page 3, which are appropriately printed in red, and you cringe. I mean, they're not just unscientific, they're blatantly racist and embarrassing. The only good thing they say about marijuana is that their satanic music, jazz and swing, resulted from marijuana use, but it also causes white women to seek sexual relations with Negroes. It's an addictive drug, produces insanity, criminality, and death. Reefer makes darkies think they're as good as white men. It leads to pacifism and communist brainwashing. It's the most violence-inducing drug in the history of mankind. That was believed by the public, by newspaper editorial writers, and by the Congress. And it left even today kind of an image that there's something wrong about marijuana. It's rushed, the laws are rushed through Congress. 92 seconds of debate on the floor of the House with Sam Rayburn saying, this bill has something to do with something called marijuana. I think it's a narcotic. The laws go on the books, shamefully. And the arrests start. And there are not that many arrests at first because there are not that many marijuana smokers. But for some reason in the 1960s, marijuana spreads beyond the minority community into the white community. Number of users increases. Unfortunately, by the way, the users are primarily in the public mind, the pot-smoking, flag-burning, war-protesting hippies. So there's another, association with marijuana culture that has nothing to do with what the drug itself does. The arrests begin to increase. They soar from 30, 40,000 a year to 300,000, 400,000 a year, and they level off at that rate. Then all of a sudden they increase again in the 1990s. They go up from 300,000 or 400,000. They almost triple to 900,000 a year. Why did that happen? Was the public clamoring for more marijuana arrests? No. Did the use increase dramatically? No. I think what happened is law enforcement figured out three things. Number one, these are easy arrests. It's late on your shift, you like a little overtime, who wouldn't? You go bust somebody for public intoxication, that's probably going to be an ugly incident. That drunk is going to throw a punch at you and throw up in your car. You arrest somebody for marijuana, likely not going to be an ugly incident at all. Secondly, there's the money. Follow the money. Money is tied to federal funding, is tied to drug arrest in a way it's not tied to any other category. Arrest drunk drivers, arrest child molesters, arrest spousal abusers. There's no immediate direct increased funding. There is for drug arrest. So where would you spend your time? On the drug arrest. And then worst of all are the forfeiture laws, which treat property as guilty. You arrest a drunk driver, you don't get to keep and sell their car. You go into spousal abuse, you don't get to say, that's my house, I'm going to sell it and keep the proceeds. You do for drug arrest. You can seize the car of a pot smoker, seize the house, and the property's guilty, so it's never, if the person is later found innocent or the charges are dropped, the property is not returned. You have to go to court to get it back. And the people who are damaged most by losing their property are those who are least able to go back and get the property. Law enforcement sells that property, or they use it. They might use that nice car themselves, but typically they sell it, and then they buy these tanks and armor and vessels and all the stuff we get with the SWAT teams now, which are another subject to itself. Or they pay themselves bonuses. Literally, there are police districts that keep the property, sell it, and pay themselves a bonus at year end. You talk about a conflict of interest or a perverse law, but that's what the drug laws do. And an arrest is, it's not a trivial event. An arrest can be a life-changing event. Lose your job, lose your financial aid if you're a student, lose custody of your children. And the arrest range are, I don't know if they're aimed disproportionately, but they fall disproportionately on minorities. Blacks don't use marijuana at any higher rate than whites. Hispanics at a lower rate, but the arrest statistics and the conviction statistics in Chicago, where I lived about 20 years, the conviction ratio of blacks to whites on marijuana is 15 to 1. So the black groups, NAACP, for many years supported the drug prohibition. They saw what the drug laws do to their communities. And then about 3 or 4 years ago, they began to realize, wait, it's less the drugs than drug prohibition. And they have come out now in support of legalization of marijuana and other drugs. So we have all these arrests. There have been more than 22 million Americans arrested on marijuana charges, about a tenth of the adult population of America. That law doesn't work. Look at the use rates on page 5. They're about the same. I mean, marijuana use has remained steady despite arresting 22 million Americans. And recently, use has begun to creep up. Interestingly, the group where use is increasing the most are my contemporaries, or younger, I guess, 55 and above. This is where the big increase in marijuana use is taking place. So we arrested a lot of people, ruined a lot of lives, spent a lot of tax dollars. Is marijuana really that dangerous? Do we need to be trying to do this? No. The greatest danger of a drug, I think, is it kills you. I mean, you can overcome addiction, overcome bodily damage. You can't overcome death. There's a chart on the bottom of page 5 that shows the lethal dose to the effective dose. If you take a little for the effect you want, how much more will kill you? Heroin's 5 to 1. So we get a lot of heroin overdoses. Interestingly, nutmeg is 7 to 1. So in your own kitchen, you have a substance that is almost as dangerous if you take too much as heroin. Alcohol is 10 to 1, which accounts for the large number of alcohol overdoses, especially on college campuses. Marijuana, it's 1,000 to 1 with an arrow pointing out there. There's never been an overdose from marijuana in the history of mankind. That's an important criterion. The chart on the top of page 6 has some other dangers, not all of them. This is a government chart, and it shows that caffeine and marijuana, they don't total it up there, but I did. They both, if you total it, have 22 points. So when you think of the harm that marijuana does by these criteria, at least it's in the range with caffeine, not tobacco or alcohol. And tobacco, by the way, is a great example of what a successful policy is. Tobacco should be every drug warrior's nightmare. It's highly addictive. Heroin addicts will tell you it's harder to get off tobacco than heroin. It's highly toxic. Lung cancer, heart disease, a whole list of damage that tobacco causes. It's available everywhere, every state, every county, every city, every village. You can easily obtain tobacco. And it's cheap. We've raised the taxes on it a lot, but boy, it's still cheap compared to most drugs. In the last 40 years, we've cut the use of tobacco more than in half. We didn't do it by arresting people and sending SWAT teams in and knocking doors down. We did it by the only thing that works: honest education and social stigma. But most importantly, honest education. The instinct for self-preservation is pretty strong. If you tell people the truth about different alternatives, they're going to migrate naturally towards the one that is least dangerous. And if you provide help if they do have trouble, you don't arrest them, you give them help, society's better off and the individual's better off. So the government lies about marijuana and the public no longer believes those lies. If you look on the chart on top of page 8, when I got involved in this issue in 1971 or 2, public support for legalization was in the teens, mid-teens. You don't change the laws with that kind of support. Then it grew, and in the last 10 years, and one of the biggest changes sociologists have ever seen, it went from 30% to 50% on the Gallup poll, 56% on the last Rasmussen poll. We probably need 60% to change laws, but it's happening. Colorado and Washington state legalized marijuana in November. It's going to be a messy process. They're going to have to figure out how to do it. But eventually, they and other states will work it out, just as we did with alcohol prohibition. When we ended it, the federal government didn't put any demands on anybody. It just took the law at the federal level off the books, and every state did what they wanted. Some did nothing. Others have such sensible laws that if I want to buy a gin and I need a tonic, I have to go to another store. Or if I need a beer, I have to go to another store. We still have some quirks left over, even in Tennessee. But support is coming, and support for medical marijuana is, in the latest poll, 80% of Republicans support it, and roughly 90% of the public. So the laws have changed there, and we have about 20 states now, and the District of Columbia, that just opened dispensaries in Congress's own backyard. You've got dispensaries now. Well, is marijuana really medicine? Yeah, it is. The earliest recorded history of marijuana, written history, is marijuana as an anti-nausea substance. Well, how can it be so effective across all these conditions? Here's how. Marijuana, we've known for years, contains cannabinoids, these chemical compounds, and maybe 60 to 100 cannabinoids in marijuana. The one we know most is THC, which is the one that's the most psychoactive. But there are other substances, other cannabinoids that offset the effects of the THC, and some that supplement it. And we discovered about 25 years ago that our body produces cannabinoids. We have an endocannabinoid system, just like a nervous system and a blood system. And we have cannabinoid receptors in every organ of our body. Our liver, our heart, our lungs, our bones, our brain. Every organ of the body except the medulla oblongata has cannabinoid receptors. And the only purpose of those cannabinoid receptors is to receive cannabinoids. And our body produces cannabinoids when a cell is under duress, being attacked by a disease, or it's malfunctioning, it's malignant, it's cancer. And the purpose of those cannabinoids is to bring the cell back into homeostasis, to make it healthy, or to kill the cell if it's cancer. So our body produces cannabinoids, and we can supplement our body's own cannabinoids by ingesting marijuana. That's why it works across so many diseases. The last few pages of the booklet are the best explanation of the cannabinoid system and what it is that I've ever seen. It's easy to read, thoughtfully written, and if you read it, you'll know more about cannabinoids than your doctor does, probably. So the public's changing its mind on medical marijuana, and most recently you may have seen Dr. Sanjay Gupta's program a week or two ago. He is the chief medical correspondent for CNN and a neurosurgeon at Emory University. And his statement on his program a week or two ago was, "We've been terribly and systematically misled for 70 years in the United States, and I apologize for my own role in that." On page 9, there's a summary from a press release by the Mayo Clinic just blasting the government for essentially prohibiting research on the therapeutic benefits of marijuana and its potentially head-to-toe therapeutic breakthroughs. The government, there's a lot of research, by the way. We hear, well, we don't really know much about marijuana. Wrong. There are more than 20,000 research, and the pace is accelerating. And they all point to the same conclusion. It's safe, and it's a safe and effective medicine. But the U.S. government won't allow, they control the supply of marijuana from that farm down in Mississippi, and they will not provide marijuana to researchers who want to research the therapeutic effects of marijuana. The only time they'll provide marijuana is to a researcher who wants to find something damaging about it. And they basically stopped doing that, because every time they do, the researcher comes back and says, well, didn't find any damage. And in fact, and my favorite story, and that's on page 11, Dr. Donald Tashkin, he was a preeminent pulmonologist and a strong opponent of legalizing marijuana. So the government says, do this study for us and show us that we have a problem with lung cancer now. We add marijuana to the mix. Oh my God, it's only going to get worse. So he does this massive study and comes back and says, well, we didn't really find any damage. In fact, we seem to find kind of a protective effect from smoking marijuana if you also smoke tobacco. And we know marijuana contains carcinogens, the smoke does, but it also contains the cannabinoids, which overwhelm the effects of marijuana. Well, yeah, but it's not FDA approved. Never will be. It's a natural plant. FDA doesn't approve natural plants. They approve chemical compounds given to them by companies that have spent tens of millions and want to put them out there in the public. And we all know what happens occasionally. The FDA will approve compounds based on a study involving a few hundred people. Mostly, until recently, all white males with no pre-existing conditions. Then you send it out into the public with minorities and women and pre-existing conditions, and it kills people. Vioxx and fen-phan. They got to withdraw it. That's not going to happen with marijuana. We have 20,000 studies. We have tens of millions of people and patients who've used marijuana for thousands of years. So it's a safe and effective medicine. And there are cost savings as well. On page 12, I got a little story of a friend here in town that called BB, but you may know her, Brenda Beatty. She wouldn't mind using her name. She's diagnosed with cancer. She goes to a friend, that would be me, who can provide cancer. She says, I don't think I'll need to provide marijuana, rather. I don't think I'll need it because I'm taking the best drugs they have to combat this nausea. And she wakes up one afternoon and thinks she's dying. And she wants to die. She considers just giving up the chemo because it can't be worse. I'd just take the cancer and die. This is awful. Then she remembers, I've got the pot. She takes a puff. A couple of minutes, the nausea is gone completely, and she's asking what's for dinner. So marijuana works as medicine. It's safe and effective. It's a safer alternative to alcohol and tobacco. If we legalize it and tax it, we can build that new stadium, and we can improve the lives of all Americans and direct tax dollars where they ought to go. Real crime, not crime that we've made up for racism and bureaucratic self-interest. So I thank you for the opportunity to speak with you, and I'd be delighted if there are any questions to try to answer.